I'm gonna go ahead and get started. I know people have things to be at. Welcome everybody. I'm really excited to see, great turnout in here, a lot on Zoom. So that's exciting. A lot of familiar faces, so I'm happy to see that too. So today we're gonna talk a little bit about trauma, supporting survivors. I have a child's mask on, so you guys are gonna have to put up. It's just what happens when you leave the house a little later than expected today. But so I'm gonna be adjusting that a lot. So this presentation kind of geared towards, we don't have a lot of time to go into the background and the biology of trauma, but really just geared towards kind of how to react when someone, whether that's personally, professionally, when someone discloses a history or a current episode of some kind of traumatic experience happening in their lives. So that's really broad. And so I've tried to really give it some like tangible kind of takeaway types of things. I teach trauma-informed care. And so this is definitely, I would say, a wheelhouse of mine, but it's really hard to condense like 15 weeks of a class into an hour. But yeah, my objective was that you guys kind of walk away with some really tangible, like actually what to say, how to create that kind of safe holding environment for people, so that we don't kind of go into panic mode when someone starts sharing these things with us, as inevitably will happen, like I said, whether that's personally or professionally. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, we have a lot of faculty and staff here and on Zoom. So I'm going to talk about like what to do if maybe a student were to disclose something to you. And then for the students and other people on, like I said, just what to do in general when you have that kind of a situation happen. So yeah, my own background, I am a licensed clinical social worker, a licensed mental health practitioner in the state of Nebraska. Before I came to Clarkson almost 5 years ago, I did a lot of therapy, a lot of work with people who had been survivors of some kind of trauma. I worked in a correctional facility setting. I worked in private practice therapy for a while. I worked in hospice for a pretty long while. So a lot of it, I have a lot of examples to draw from. I'll probably share some of those. And this is interactive. So whether you're on Zoom or you're here, yell a question out, raise your hand, whatever makes you feel most comfortable, but absolutely feel free to interact as we go along. So there we go. Okay, so just a brief trigger warning. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but 70% of adults have a history of some kind of traumatic experience or episode. So chances are someone listening today, someone in the room today has their own history of trauma. It can be hard not only today, not only in talking about these things, but definitely when you're dealing with other people's trauma, it can be hard not to have some kind of triggering effects. So just keep in mind that, I want to put it out there. Julie's here, obviously, from the Success Center. I'm here. We have counselors on campus. If today brings up anything for you, or just if there's anything that you feel like, you want to talk to somebody about after today, please, please, please feel free to use your resources, reach out to one of us, and we can help you. And I want to put it out there too. Obviously, this is easy for the Zoomers, but if you are triggered by something we talk about today, turn your camera off, turn your mic off, get up, walk out, whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, that would be most important to me. And like I said, just feel free to then reach out after that happens. Okay. All right, so let's start with just a brief definition. Like I said, in trauma-informed care, we spend a week or two looking at the definitions of trauma and all the different types of trauma. So this I'm going to try to do in like 3 or 4 minutes, right? It's a little bit harder, but to be very brief, trauma simply occurs when someone is overwhelmed by any kind of events or circumstances that cause them to respond with like fear, horror, helplessness. Control is a big thing with trauma, right? If we feel all of a sudden like these events or circumstances are out of our control, and that perpetuates fear, that can be trauma. Trauma simply is some kind of extreme stress that overwhelms our ability to cope. It's beyond our ability to cope or adapt with whatever's happening. Where does that come from? It can come from a lot of different places. There's a lot of different types of trauma. It's not always what we assume it is, certainly. War and violence, right? We see a lot of veterans, a lot of people in the armed services struggling with trauma because of violence that they've either experienced, maybe violence that they've even been like the instigator of, right? Or maybe violence that they just witnessed, right? So maybe it wasn't even something they were involved in, but it's something they saw. Extreme injury can, or just like seeing people extremely injured can definitely be traumatic. The other way witnessing acts of violence can occur is like with kids, right? I mean, it can occur with anybody and perpetuate trauma, but like with kids specifically who might witness like their parents in some kind of a domestic violence situation, definitely could produce some trauma. Also, any other childhood abuse or neglect, right, where the child is actually the direct recipient of that violence or neglect. But it doesn't stop at childhood, right? Then we have any kind of physical, emotional, or sexual assault as a child, as an adult. So you really see trauma potentially spanning the lifespan, I guess, but definitely the ability to occur at all developmental stages. And certainly that has an impact on the way then the trauma is kind of relived and, you know, kind of carried on through the lifespan. Grief and loss can produce trauma. We talk a lot about that in a class I teach, Death and Dying. We talk about traumatic loss and how that can happen, all the different ways that you can be traumatized by some kind of loss, whether that's, again, like maybe you witnessed something, maybe you're traumatized by actually finding out, right? That can produce some trauma. So anything like that. Then, so we have like a whole different thing where we're planning on bringing this subject back to campus, but again, this could be a whole nother presentation in itself. But then we see cultural, intergenerational, and historical trauma. This is really hard to get into, again, without really getting into it, but this is like the trauma that either you experience as a result maybe of your culture, maybe you have some intergenerational effects of trauma that have been passed on. Like trauma can literally be passed on in your DNA. You can have traumatic effects to DNA that you then pass on to your offspring. And it's a really, really interesting subject. And again, I think we're planning on bringing some speakers back to campus about that. But that's another way that trauma can kind of manifest in someone. And then historical trauma. So again, things like racism, right? Any kind of cultural oppression can produce trauma. And that, of course, we see over several generations usually. So why should we care about, well, specifically even about other people's trauma, right? We're all caregivers. Everybody in this room is in, you know, this profession because they care somewhat for other people, right? So it's good to know that people who have experienced trauma have massive health disparities. They are at increased risks for many different things. If you guys have ever heard of a study called the ACEs study, or it's ACEs because the S is for study. So it's like saying ATM machine, but anyway. So if you guys have ever heard of ACEs, then you kind of, some of this information probably is familiar to you. If you haven't, I would encourage you to research it a little bit more. The ACE study has been done, it's pretty widespread at this point, but it was done initially on some children who had experienced trauma, followed them across the lifespan, and then realized there's all of these increased risks. Depending on how many traumatic experiences a child has been through, they are at all of the increased risks you see here. So like I said, 70% of adults in the US have experienced some kind of traumatic event in their lives. So that increases the potential that you at any point in time, whether that's with a patient or with a friend or with a family member, you could be interacting with someone with a history of trauma. So that's important to know. Your own response and how that needs to be different, that's important to know. Trauma increases risky behaviors, right? It increases some of the things that we look at here in terms of like things like smoking, drinking, injecting drugs, STDs. These are all as a result of the fact that trauma increases our own health risk behaviors, but also things like overeating, risky sex, obviously with the STDs, stuff like that. If trauma is not addressed, it can significantly increase the risk of a lot of mental substance use disorders, suicide, chronic physical ailments. We all kind of know that, you know, mental pain a lot of times will lead to somatic or physical pain, right? And eventually we see people who have, again, depending on the amount of trauma, but people who have experienced trauma oftentimes having lower life expectancies, potentially because of all these things, right? So the only way really to mediate the effects of trauma, the only way to really kind of solve all of these, not that you can really solve them, but it's to address it, right? The problem with that is that on average, survivors of trauma tell 7 people before anyone either believes them or offers to help. So that's 7 people that they try to reach out to before anybody really knows how to respond. So that's a problem, right? That's lessens the potential that someone with trauma is going to know how or maybe reach out again. The compounding effect of that is that every time someone responds, maybe in not the best way, I'll give an example of that in a minute. Every time someone responds in a way that is like disempowering to a survivor, that's like a re-traumatization, right? That's like kind of opening that scab up again. And the survivor then has to kind of experience those raw emotions and feelings by themselves again. I had a client once, she was actually a client in the correctional facility, but she had a history of a lot of things. But one day she was telling me about a time that she had been raped. And she went to the emergency room after it happened. She went and they did like the emergency physical, you know, STD test, all that kind of stuff. And the nurse at the time that she was examining her said, "Did you say no? Like, are you sure it was rape? Did you say no?" And she said, "Yes." She went beyond that and said, "Did you say no 100 times? Did you say no over and over and over?" And I was like, oh my goodness. Like my heart broke for her, because then she was like, well, maybe I didn't say no enough. Maybe I wasn't clear enough. But it's those kinds of things, right? It's those kinds of victim blaming, victim shaming, kind of disempowering responses, and maybe not even to that extent. You know, there's really simple things we say, like, how much had you been drinking? Were you drunk? Right? What'd you wear? You let him take you on a date, right? Like these freedoms that we don't, for some reason, allow victims of trauma to have, right? So it's kind of those responses that we'll talk a little bit more, but it's really those kinds of things that can really re-traumatize and really perpetuate that cycle of trauma for the survivor for years and sometimes decades, sometimes a lifetime. The most promising opportunity to identify victims and get intervention is with healthcare providers. And I think that's important for you to know too, because a lot of times healthcare providers are those trusted people. Healthcare providers are the ones they have a relationship with, right? Sometimes it comes up just in that appointment, depending on that rapport, depending on that relationship. So I think it's really, really important that you guys have these skills, you guys have these tools to be able to know how to effectively address this so we don't panic. Because like, let's be honest, this kind of stuff is not easy to talk about. It's not fun to talk about. And a lot of times when we go to have these conversations, especially if we're not prepared for it, it doesn't go well because all you want to do is make it go away. And I get it. But that doesn't do any good. That's very, very harming for the person who's trying to reach out for help, right? Okay, so before we talk about some actual kind of to-dos, we really need to talk about how, or emphasize the importance of like creating this safe space and what the components are to creating a safe space. So I have a few here. I kind of wish I would have put arrows because we're going to start kind of up here and go clockwise. They kind of build off of each other in a little bit, but what we're really trying to do is create kind of this like safe holding environment once we realize like someone's ready, or even before that, right? We want to make people feel like this is a safe place to say whatever you need to say. And this is kind of how to do that. So the first one's empathy. I'm pretty sure most people are familiar, but sometimes empathy and sympathy get a little muddled. So I just want to clarify that a little bit. So empathy is really just the capacity to understand and kind of vicariously experience whatever that person is sharing with you. The term or the phrase like put yourself in someone else's shoes really speaks to empathy, right? Like maybe I don't have any relationship to what you're sharing with me. I have not experienced that for myself, but I can try to imagine what that feels like. That's kind of that capacity for empathy, right? So as we go down to about 3 o'clock there, we see compassion. So again, this kind of builds off empathy. So not only are we willing to kind of try to experience someone else's experiences and emotions, we kind of want to also acknowledge and attend to those in a non-judgmental way. So we're allowing ourselves to try to feel what they're feeling without the kind of wagging of the finger, or here's what I would do, right? We're kind of putting our own experiences with that, our own feelings, judgments, whatever about that aside, and just trying to experience what they are sharing with us or what they are kind of feeling. So that's that compassion piece. Then in terms of containment, if we go further around the circle there, that's really then being able to do this and this. So being able to have empathy, to have compassion, while not really emotionally reacting ourselves. And what I mean by that is if someone shares something with you, and we'll talk about this in a minute, kind of in the what not to do's, if someone shares something with you, if I had a student in my office and they're like, you know, something happened at a party last weekend, and here's what, you know, I think that I met this guy and I don't remember, I think he had sex with me. And I was like, oh my God, like, that's not okay. And I'm yelling and I'm crying and you know, that person is going to be like, I should not have shared this with you. Like, that was not a safe thing for me to do because now I have made you upset, right? I need to really be a calming presence in that kind of a disclosure. I need to kind of bear witness to my own emotions and keep those in check so that I can contain this for you, right? That's kind of that containment piece. I can be a container for your emotions. And then all three of those things kind of create that holding environment, right? So kind of if we tease out all four of these things, we're just trying to create that safe, non-judgmental, compassionate environment for our patients, for our clients, regardless of what role you play in their lives. You know, the thing I want to add about this, the reason specifically why it's so important to create this kind of a safe, non-judgmental place for survivors of trauma is because a lot of times they have lost that feeling of safety. Like they don't know what's safe and what's not in the world. So this becomes really, really important. Sometimes even like in their own bodies, they don't know how to feel safe or tell between safe and unsafe. So this is critical for people who are survivors of any kind of trauma. Okay, so what should I do? So we're gonna spend a little more time on this slide. This is kind of where we get to those more tangible, right, things that you can kind of put in your toolbox. So just a list of 6 here, pretty important things in terms of research, you know, qualitative and quantitative. These are kind of those best practices, right? So number 1, Resist the urge, because you will get it because you're human. Resist the urge to operate out of a place of curiosity. What does that mean? So I'm not going to ask every detail about that party or that sexual assault or whatever you're trying to disclose to me. I'm going to resist the urge to get all the kind of meat out of it. I am going to respect that you are sharing with me whatever feels good for you to share with me. And I'm just going to listen and believe you, right? I'm just going to try to avoid asking a lot of detailed questions, because then I run the risk of, again, re-traumatizing you, because now I've asked you to share more than what you're really comfortable sharing. Or maybe I asked you to share something that you don't understand yet, or you don't remember yet, because trauma fragments our memory, right? So there's a lot of potential that you could not remember things in the right order. There could be pieces completely missing that just haven't resurfaced for you yet. So it's really dangerous to start asking a lot of detailed questions. Just simply taking what they're saying at face value and believing them, right? What happened to you is not your fault and you're not alone, right? So taking that judgment out of it. This was not your fault and you're not alone. The second one that's really important is expressing appreciation. And this always, I tell people, if you don't know what else to say thank you, right? If you don't know what else to say, you have no words, you know what? That must have been really hard for you to talk about. And I really am grateful that you've shared that with me. I'm honored that you chose me to share that with, and I'm going to help you. However that looks, I'm going to help, right? So just really, again, if you're uncomfortable and you don't know what to say, thank you is one of the best things that you can possibly say in this situation. It removes the burden, right? They don't feel that you are now like burdened with that, or that they've upset you, or that they've somehow, right, like ruined your day. So that's always a really good one. Validating their feelings. This is hard because we come kind of from a culture of fixers. We don't like to see people in pain, so we like to fix it. And that's not going to happen. Like, I'm just going to take the wind out of your sails right now. That's not going to happen with these people, right? You're not going to fix it, especially not when they're initially disclosing it. So the more important thing is that you just validate their feelings, kind of hopping back up to that first one, right? What happened to you is not your fault. Also just saying, like, you know what, it makes sense to me that you're angry, anxious, panicked, sad, scared, whatever. That makes sense to me. I think I would be too, right? I can't begin to imagine what you're going through right now. So if it's not comfortable for you maybe to go here and try to put yourself there, even though that's kind of that compassion that we're talking about, right? Even saying something like, you know, I can't imagine how you're feeling right now, but I'm here for you. I want to be here for you. I want to support you. That's kind of creating that same safe space. Okay. Empowering them without pushing. We don't ever want to push somebody. So specifically with adults, when someone discloses something, unless there are kids or vulnerable populations involved, obviously that changes things dramatically. But if it's an adult disclosing something to you that happened to them, we are not going to push them to call in law enforcement, right? Again, we're respecting their process and where they are with it, and we're going to be willing to help. We're going to be beacons of resources, but we can't push them. We can't force them, because then again, that not only makes you somewhat unsafe, it reduces the chance that they are then going to tell other people, right? That they're going to reach out for help again. So how do we empower them without pushing? Just saying something like, you don't deserve this, right? You didn't deserve this. This shouldn't have happened to you. I'm sorry this happened to you. All of those kinds of things, letting them know that it wasn't fair and it wasn't okay, but that we're not going to pressure them, right? And I'm going to, before I even talk about providing appropriate resources, I'm going to let Julie kind of speak to Title IX quickly, because that changes things in terms of faculty and staff.
Great, thanks. Okay, hi, I'm Julie Taylor Costello. I'm the Director of Academic Services here on campus. I'm the Title IX coordinator. And Rachel asked me to kind of chime in a little bit because as a college organization, our faculty and staff are mandatory reporters. And you as healthcare workers, I know there's law and legislature, things like that. So you're going to want to make sure you're familiar with those things. On a college campus, though, it falls under Title IX. And so if you or someone you know goes and talks to any employee on campus except for Jenny Kissinger and Julie Brummer, who are two licensed counselors on campus, they by law have to come and tell me. I hope I'm not a scary person when that comes to me. I'm not. But if something were to happen to you or somebody you know, then once I'm notified, then I will reach out to that person or to you and say, hey, let's talk about this. And we will go through a lot of what Rachel has talked about as far as like, you know, we're going to make sure you have the support that you need. If it's something that happened here on campus, we'll make sure that everything is taken care of so that you have access to education, but then also the respondent, you know, may also have to come into play. There's a whole policy on this, and I don't even want to get into details because I could take up the whole hour. The big thing is that if you have somebody that is a friend of yours that comes to you, please know that we are here to help. As a Title IX coordinator, I can discuss options from doing absolutely nothing all the way to getting law enforcement involved and anything in between. So know that there are options out there and that we're here to help. There is a form online under Title IX, so you can fill out a form if you want to report some sort of any kind of misconduct that you think could fall into a traumatizing situation. You can come and see me directly. I'm up in the Success Center on the second floor of the Student Center. You can call me, you can email me, or you can get a hold of Title IX coordinator at Clarkson College, and that comes straight to my email as well. So any questions on Title IX real quick? No, the big thing is to know that we have a process in place and that we are here to help you. Because you going into the healthcare field, no matter what program you're in, you're probably going to deal with patients of some sort that have gone through a traumatic experience. I think of physical therapy, sometimes people have had to have surgery because they got, you know, pushed down this flight of stairs, you know, and that story might come out. Same thing with RTMI. They're getting x-rays because somebody maybe beat them up or they were assaulted. And then obviously nursing, same thing. So every program will come into contact with some sort of traumatic experience. That's my spiel.
Thank you. No, that's perfect. That I put that right there specifically because I think it's important, especially like for any faculty or staff who are on today, to know that, you know, just because we would have to say something about, you know, because of Title IX, you know, and I work on a college campus, I do have to tell Julie, but that does not mean that we're still not going to push you to do anything, right? It's just Title IX. It doesn't mean that we get police officers involved unless you want that. So there's still the full spectrum of options is still available. I encourage people to think of Title IX as a resource, right? It's a resource for help. I think a lot of times people think of it just because of how it's kind of touted in the media and stuff as like punitive or almost like judicial, right? And it definitely does not need, it can be an extra layer of support for sure. So that's important. But yeah, when you are with somebody and they disclose, it is appropriate then to just know your resources, right? Know some amount, depending on the context, depending on the setting. Obviously, again, kind of like Julie talked about, and like we talked about, being on a college campus, we have a plethora of resources. We have our own college counselors. We have EAP set up through Arbor. All of that is an option. We have the most loving and caring faculty and staff body I've ever encountered, who's I think absolutely willing to help students, especially in these kind of situations. But you know, in your hospitals, in your clinics, you have MSWs, right? You have a team, usually of professionals, who are going to be more than willing to get involved in these situations and help you help patients. So you also are not alone in this. It's absolutely crucial that if that if this were to happen, you would know your resources. And referrals too, right? Like within the community. And I have a few of those kind of at the end here, but there are a lot of things that we can do to help people if they're there, right? If they're there, not because we're going to push that on them, but if that's where they are and they're ready to take whatever that next step is, whether that be help in terms of therapy or in terms of law enforcement or in terms of Title IX, we just need to know that we can know who to contact or who to tell them to contact, right? So here are just a couple of helpful statements, right? You've taken the first step. Thank you for telling me, right? I'm honored. You took that first step. Whenever you're ready, I'd like to help you take that next one, whatever that looks like for you, right? That's a lot for a person to go through. You deserve support. That word deserve is important. I want to point that out. You'll see that like a couple of times in the examples up there. They need to know what they didn't deserve and what they deserve now, right? You didn't deserve that. And what you deserve now is help and support and love. Because again, sometimes that sense of, that sense of safety, that sense of world is completely shaken for them. So these are important things to like validate and reiterate to these types or this population. I wonder if you're seeing a therapist. I wonder if you're getting any help. Is there anybody else you're talking to about this? So that can be a good kind of starter to kind of gauge where they are in terms of whether or not they have access to any help. And then keep checking in and be patient. Sometimes this process can take a long time. I actually give a talk to one of the classes, one of the radiography classes specifically about domestic violence, because that is something that they need to know about, even in terms of what injuries to be looking for. But I tell them the average, I'm speaking to women here, but the average woman who eventually leaves an interpersonal violent relationship leaves 7 times before she's done, right? There's just this whole cycle, again, totally different day, totally different presentation, but there's this whole cycle that's typical, the patterns that are typical in those types of relationships. And a lot of times that pattern has to repeat itself many, many, many times before that person is willing to finally leave. And sometimes it's flat out dangerous to leave. And that can be very important to validate too. Again, kind of goes back to not pushing. We don't know where they are. We don't know how safe it is. And I have a slide here in a minute that I actually give in that presentation too. Again, kind of specific to more like acute situations of trauma, whether they're currently in, it's one thing if they're kind of sharing a past history of trauma. It's one thing if they're saying like, I'm in this situation now. And that kind of makes things different too. But the important part is to not push anything and keep checking in, following up, right? Remembering them. That can be crucial as well. So if they are in a current situation, or if that's what they disclose, I think it's important too, especially while you've got them in person, to assess the situation as best you can. This isn't like any formal type of assessment. So I'm not like training you to be mini therapists or anything like that. These are just some good things to ask for kind of gauging how dangerous it is for them at the time. Things like, do you feel safe going home today? Are your children safe? So this can be one where we need to let them know probably even before asking that. If there's children involved, then that makes me a mandatory reporter, right? Then I'm going to have to actually take some action if you tell me that children are not safe. Are there guns in the home? That obviously increases lethality. If someone is in a violent situation and there's access to guns, then it becomes like 500% more dangerous in terms of it ending with death or with homicide. Do you need an immediate place of safety? So kind of assessing if they're ready for that kind of a referral. Have you considered a plan of action? So this is good in just kind of getting them thinking Okay, so what if something were to happen? What if we weren't open? You needed to leave. Where would you go? Who's your support system? All of those things can be really helpful just to even kind of get them thinking a little bit. Do you have emergency numbers? The caveat to this is, and there's different things that places can provide. We've had the Women's Center for Empowerment come speak before, and it gets a little dangerous to give people, especially if they're in current like IPV types of relationships, interpersonal violence types of relationships. You give them like cards or papers or brochures. You can imagine what would happen if they went home with those, right? Or if those were found. So I think it's Women's Center for Advancement, I'm sorry. They have things like, I'm trying to remember the last time they were here, they had examples. I think they had things like maybe like nail files that had like a fake business, but then the Women's Center for Advancement number on it. So things like that can be really helpful because we want to be really careful about giving them any actual like tangible things to take with them depending on their situation. Have you ever been choked? This is one I tell the radiography students specifically, if you're seeing that on images, that's another one. Once a woman has been choked, that increases lethality even more than access to guns. At that point, she is like 7 times more at risk of dying because once someone has choked you, they've basically proven to you that they are willing to kill you, to do that like as long as it takes, right? That's about as far as you can go before you actually go there. So that can be important too, because this can be an education piece, right? That can be important for someone to know. A lot of times that may occur pretty early on. And then it's kind of like a little bit of a reality check for somebody, right? So that can be very important as well. As important as what to do is what not to do. I already kind of talked about reacting dramatically. We just don't want them to feel like they've burdened us in any way. Using cliches, right? This happens a lot. Anytime someone talks about something that we're not comfortable with, we tend to react in cliches, right? Does anybody have an example maybe? I have a couple, but what could this look like or sound like? Stuff like, there are, yeah, at least anything that starts with at least, right? You're not the only one yet. I mean, there's power in you're not alone, but yes, you're not the only one can almost be a little dismissive, right? Things like whatever doesn't kill us makes us stronger, you know, or there's always the one, and I get like these come out of good places, but there's always the one that God doesn't give you more than you can handle. Sometimes I want to be like, you know, sometimes it really feels like He does. But anytime we're kind of reacting with that, like Julie, anything that starts with that at least, and I'm just thinking of like, you know, at least he didn't, whatever, like at least he hasn't done that in front of the kids. At least like anything like that is just like we're grasping at something, we're trying to find a silver lining. But if that's not where they are, and typically it's not, right? That's the exact opposite of saying like, you didn't deserve this. This wasn't okay, right? We're use cliches to just kind of make it a little more comfortable. Anytime you start a question with why, I think I say this in every one of my classes, so if you've had me before, I apologize. Anytime you start a question with why, that intends to incite a defensive response, even if you didn't intend it, right? Because sometimes when we start a question with why, people are automatically like, why? Like that's saying like, you know, why'd you have that much to drink? Why did you let him get you a drink? Don't you know you're not supposed to, you know, that kind of thing is, again, kind of that victim blaming, victim shaming kind of mentality. Anytime we try to give them advice, right? It's back to that kind of, here's what I would do. I can tell you, if anyone ever tried to hit me, this is what I would do. So again, we are not, if we went back to that slide about creating that holding space, creating that safe container, this is the exact opposite. Because I can't be compassionate, I can't be empathetic if I'm trying to tell you what I would do. because that's the exact opposite. I'm trying to hold your space, not push mine on you, right? And I need to report this to the police. Obviously, that one will shut them down before they've even started. Now, like I said, if there's vulnerable populations involved, if at all possible, I would tell them even before, right? Like if there's vulnerable populations involved, then that's a little bit different. But if we're talking about kind of that adult to adult disclosure, that can definitely shut it down. I like this quote. I use this again in my talk to the radiography students, but I think it's important too to recognize the toll this takes on us. And specifically, if you've had this happen, it's just important to realize and have some insight into that potential for like vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. The quote is, if we are to do our work with suffering people and environments in a sustainable way, meaning if we're not going to get burnt out, right, which is high in healthcare anyway, we must understand how our work affects us. And I would go one step further and say, we also have to have ways to kind of make that better for ourselves, right? And I won't turn this into a huge talk on self-care, but that's definitely a part of it. Common reactions to caring for survivors of trauma, these mimic even trauma responses themselves. I mean, there is something to be said that secondary trauma is truly in its purest form trauma. Fear, helplessness, sleep disruptions, those are all also symptoms of trauma, right? Depressive symptoms, lack of work satisfaction. All of a sudden, I'm not wanting to come to work. Well, is that because I have some trauma over what happened here, right? Recurrent thoughts of threatening situations. There's even been some research on vicarious trauma that shows that people can like put themselves. So we think visually, like a lot of us think in terms of pictures. So when someone's telling us a story about themselves, we might be picturing that. And a lot of times people with vicarious trauma say that those are the images. So instead of people with like primary PTSD who might have those intrusive images of the thing that happened, right? The trauma. People with secondary PTSD will say that they have the same kinds of images, but almost like these are images I created when I was listening to this story, right? But these are the things that keep intruding, that keep reoccurring. Starting to like lose empathy or react negatively to patients. This is a big one too. This is a huge sign of burnout anyway, but definitely when it comes to trauma. And then obviously thinking of quitting work, chronic suspicion of others, just kind of starting to think that the world maybe isn't such a great place. That's not where we want to be as helping professionals, definitely, but as people too. So it's important to know if you're experiencing any of those things that you need to take care of yourself. How many of you would say you actively take care of yourselves when it comes to work or school stress? Oh no, hopefully the Zoomers have a better rate. This is really important, and I'll read it. I know you guys are busy. I know a lot of you work and go to school at the same time. I'm right there with you. I do too. But it's so, so important. And I'm also saying this, I'm preaching to myself. It's so important that you take care of yourself, especially on the days where you like viscerally feel like you need it, right? And this can take a lot of different forms. I usually have no shame in putting out there that I jazzercise. If you want to join me at jazzercise, it's like the most fun, also like, physically healthy for you thing that I can imagine to do when I'm stressed out. But any of these things, right? Socializing, like getting out and getting around people, which is hard right now. But even like texting somebody, calling somebody, in terms of like when you've had these kind of instances that we've been talking about today, these tough conversations with people, it can be really helpful to debrief like with a team. So if there's other people that were involved in the same situation, just kind of being able to debrief, being able to process and kind of let those feelings out. Therapy kind of works that same way, right? That same kind of verbal process. But that's really important. Taking a bath, right? Just showing showing ourselves that we can care and take care of our own bodies. Things like knitting. Does anybody else have any things they do for themselves? Maybe not regularly, but reading. Anything that's distracting, right? Distraction can be a good thing. And so anything like that, Julie, are there Zoomers? Podcasts. Yes, yes, all of these are good things. Podcasts, coloring books, yoga, puzzles. Again, puzzles can be really good for people like in high emotional states, because there's actually been research on puzzles on how intensely your brain has to work. I mean, depending on the puzzle, obviously, but like your brain almost can't feel things because it's working so hard at doing these puzzles. I used to teach my the men that I didn't want to say my men, the men that were in jail that I worked with, the same kind of thing with math. Like if you struggle with anger, if you count, I used to tell them like count backwards. If you're in traffic and you're experiencing some road rage, count backwards by threes from 100. Like your brain has to work and it's automatically a huge distraction. So anything like that, yeah, very good. But obviously those more relaxing things too, like yoga, like meditation, that kind of thing too, can really help us out. So my last slide is kind of some of the resources and references that I either used today or that can be helpful for you. While you guys are looking at that, is there any questions either in here or on Zoom? Any questions, comments, stories, situations, anything like that? Yes. Good. So Greta's asking, like, what if the person that is actually disclosed to you starts kind of using some of those cliches on themselves, right? Some of those things like, well, I guess at least it wasn't this, or, you know, I guess I can handle it, whatever. I would then, if I can go back real quick here, slowly. I would then go back to some of these other statements, because the fact if they're using those, they've probably had, you know, remember that they've probably told several people before you, and they've probably had those people say those things. So they're kind of trying to diffuse the situation probably and make it more comfortable by saying those things themselves. And so I would respond with some of these, like, no, you didn't deserve this. No, like, you know, stop with the at least. It's like, this was a horrible thing. This was a horrible thing. And you deserve support. You deserve love. You deserve help. So maybe just responding with some of these more validating and affirming things. I have 3 little girls, and a lot of times, even when it's not negative talk, but maybe talk like that, I tell them, like, I love you. And you're probably not going to say this to like any old person, but like, I don't want you talking about yourself. Like, I don't appreciate you talking like that to someone, about someone that I love, right? So the fact that they are doing this probably means that there's not a lot of self-love there right now. And so I think it's just important to like kind of pepper them with these very affirming, validating statements, right? Love-filled statements. Good. Yes, sorry. Oh, good. Okay, yes. There, yes. So I think these are opportunities, because again, we're not talking about, so if there's children involved, then that's a whole nother process. But like if there are guns in the home, if they've been choked, these are points where I think education can be very helpful, right? Okay, so the fact that I know that there are guns in the home makes this a little more concerning to me. And here's why. I know that now lethality, you know, you don't have to use like numbers or percentages, but now I know that that your danger is, your risk of something happening that's lethal is significantly higher because there's guns or because you've been choked. You know, and so just kind of a point of education, I think, is good there. These other things, like I said, like the plan of action thing, that's just to really get them thinking. If they say no, they don't have a plan of action, then maybe we can talk through that a little bit. Who are supportive others in your life? Maybe it's just you. Maybe it's just a healthcare provider. But that's important too. Like, okay, here's how you can get to me. Let's talk this through a little bit. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's just, actually somebody who's
Mhm.
has, hey, I want to talk to you. About
Right.
this. Hey, you're, hey, I wanna
Right.
talk about it. I just want to make sure that I'm not doing
For
what
sure.
I should be doing in terms of the license perspective.
Right.
I don't want to, dismiss or do anything that would make them not want to tell me more, but I know there's other people that could help them better.
Right. And that's the thing too, is it does depend a lot on situation and context. And I think that's important too, because if this were like my sister telling me, totally different than if this were like a patient telling me, right? My responses are going to be a lot different. The fact that you're licensed in a medical field means that you kind of have some P's and Q's to watch a little bit. But I think this is where, like I said, you have that team, you need to get that MSW involved. Probably, hopefully, wherever you work has one at least on call, if not there, in the building. But this is where I would really say, hey, can I invite our social worker down? He or she is not going to pressure you to do anything. They're just a good kind of person to give you some resources, give you some referrals if you don't feel. That's where like some of these statements are perfect for if you don't feel like this is in your scope. Like, I don't want you to do anything that's not in your scope, or you don't feel like it's within your role. These statements are within everybody's role, right? But if we're going here and you don't feel quite adequate enough, I would say call in someone from the interdisciplinary team to help. Yeah. Yeah. Does Zoomers have?
Okay, so 2 comments. Awesome job, Rachel.
Oh,
Thank you.
thanks.
We love this presentation for the radiography program. Thank you for sharing with
Oh,
the
yeah.
community, with the college. And then a question,
Mhm.
in your practice, do you do anything to help yourself after listening to these disclosures?
Right. So I would just say I don't work with clients anymore. When I did, I only lasted like almost 3 years when I worked in the correctional facility setting. That was a lot. But what I started to notice after a while was this. I started kind of both of these things. I started kind of assuming the worst about people. I started losing a lot of empathy for the inmates, and kind of almost even outside of work. I started to get very like, this is just men, right? Like, so I knew when I needed to move on. And I wasn't so burnt out that I left the field, thankfully, but I knew when I needed to work with a different population. And I think that's really important too. I had enough insight to know that my time here, like, I'm not doing them any good. Now, if I had addressed that sooner and maybe taken a little bit more care of myself, put a little bit more distance between myself and work, I think I probably could have lasted longer in that field. But I think just by doing some of the self-care things, everybody has a thing. I will say that. Like, you may not have found it yet. I don't know, 10 years ago, if you would have been telling me that jazzercise was my thing, I would have laughed. But it is. It absolutely is. So I would just encourage you to like explore a lot of the things we talked about today. Self-care can look different for everybody. I am sorry, this is probably not the greatest thing to say, but sometimes self-care is a value meal 9 at McDonald's. That's fine. Like, don't judge yourself for your self-care. Sometimes you have to do what feels good. And as long as that's not hurting you, which, the value meal 9 could over time, but as long as it's not hurting you or anybody else, just pay attention to what sounds or feels good to do for you kind of in that moment. Hopefully that answered that question a little bit.
No other questions have come in.
Okay.
So we're good now.
Okay. Any other questions or something like that? We got a couple more minutes here. Okay, well, if anybody has anything,
IPE reminder.
oh, yes, so which IPE?
Knowledge and community credit if you've done the first 4
Okay,
modules,
so-
don't forget to fill that out.
Yeah, so if you haven't, for those of you Zooming, if you've done the first 4 modules of IPE, this can be a reflection for either knowledge or community. So make sure, I think you have 90 days to submit that. Obviously, you want to do it sooner than that, but yes, and fill out the evaluations, please. And I will plan on being here at least for the next 5 or 10 minutes. So if anybody has any questions, and feel free to reach out to me too. I guess I didn't put my email anywhere on here, but you all have a Clarkson email, so you can find it pretty easily. So just reach out if you have any questions, concerns, comments. Otherwise, thank you guys for coming. I appreciate it. Thank you, Zoomers.